Welcome to the inaugural session of Operationalizing Learning Communities for Learning Health Systems. My name is Jane Ferraro, and I am a project manager in the Department of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan Medical School. We are delighted to share the afternoon with you as we explore the nature of learning communities together. And I'll begin with a little light housekeeping, and that'll give more people time to join. This main session will be recorded. The breakout sessions will not be. The recording and slide decks will be available shortly after the session. Please mute your audio when not speaking. You can turn on the closed caption feature if Zoom is needed. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat pod or ask them during the question and answer. The plan for this afternoon, hopefully you've received a copy of the agenda and the scenarios for the breakout rooms. They were sent this morning. If not, please let us know in the chat box and we will mail them, email them to you immediately. Dr. Charles Friedman will launch the workshop with an introduction about the importance of learning communities. Next, Dr. Alexandra Vinson will discuss the culture of the learning community. Afterwards, Lisa Ferguson, Michelle Williams, and I will walk you through kind of the nuts and bolts of some of the steps that help build, grow, and sustain a learning community. We are all project managers who have extensive experience working with a variety of them. We will take a 10-minute break at around 2:30 and then resume by breaking out into small group discussions. We designed the scenarios to give you time to talk with each other. And because we have a dynamic mix of attendees, we hope you will have time to share some of your own situations in the smaller groups. We will reform into the larger group to report out and wrap up by 4 p.m. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Charles Friedman, Department Chair of Learning Health Sciences, Professor of Medical Education, Professor of Information, and Professor of Public Health at the University of Michigan. Chuck?
Okay, thank you, Jane. I'm going to share my screen now so I can drive the slides. Let me see if this works. And it has worked. So I will go now into slide view. Okay, it's a view of my slides meeting all requirements.
Yes,
okay.
Looks great.
Okay, so first of all, let me begin by saying that if you came to the previous workshop in this series, the LHS 101 workshop, these slides, except for the reformatting, should look extremely familiar to you because they're identical to some slides that I showed then. Still, I think this presentation, this very short presentation that I'm going to make, might lay a useful foundation for the very interesting workshop to follow on the very important topic of learning communities. So to begin, a little bit about learning health systems in general. The goal of learning health systems is to improve health by marrying discovery and implementation. People often ask me, well, is the learning health system about discovery? And I say yes. And they say, is it about implementation? And I say yes. And I think that's probably the best way I know to describe what a learning health system is. It's a marriage of the two, and the marriage has all the characteristics of a marriage. It is tight, and it is enduring. Playing this out in more detail, you can think about a learning health system as having 5 specific features, and I like to talk about this as the things that an inspector would be looking for, what would be on that inspector's checklist, so to speak, if an inspector were coming to a learning health system and trying to figure out to what extent this health system is a learning health system. Well, the first item on the checklist, which would be on the inspector's clipboard, you see on the top of the right of the slide, can this health system capture, and does it routinely capture, what happens in the system, all types of activities as data to learn from? So do they capture what they do, and do they capture it as data? Second item on the checklist, do they analyze this data and convert this to knowledge that is trusted, that is rapidly deployed in some way to support decisions, and not just decisions by care providers, but also decisions by patients and managers and others who participate in the system. Third feature is, does this system do this continuously and in an enduring way through ongoing cyclic activity? And as we're going to see in the workshop today, this cyclic activity is driven by these learning communities, which makes these learning communities extremely important. Is there an infrastructure in place? The fourth item on the checklist that enables this to happen routinely and with economy of scale. If there is an economy of scale in the way a learning health system operates, it's not clear if this would be sustainable. And finally, over time, has all of this become a part of the culture? If you ask people in this system why they do these things, why they do the things higher up on the checklist, they probably wouldn't be able to tell you. They just say, well, this is who we are, and this is what we do here. So these are 5 characteristics that you can think of as characteristics of a learning health system that has the ability to improve health through discovery and implementation. So what makes this different from other approaches that are in the world to improve health, to improve the health of individuals and populations, and not just through mechanisms of care, but through all kinds of interventions that can promote health? Well, I think there are 3 differentiators, one of which is this role of learning communities. The first differentiator, which won't be emphasized today, but I think is going to find its way into the discussion, is that in a learning health system, uncertainty is embraced. In other words, at the start of an improvement process, what we call an improvement cycle, it isn't really clear what is going to be implemented to affect that improvement. The community discovers this through the collection and analysis of data. So uncertainty is embraced. If the problem is difficult enough or systemic enough or complex enough to merit an intervention of the type that learning health systems implement, you most typically won't know what the solution is or what the best thing to do is, and that will have to be discovered. The second is this idea of multi-stakeholder learning communities, which enable these learning and improvement cycles to take place and enable them to take place with continuity, which is very, very important. And this happens because the learning community follows the improvement cycle through its entire duration. There are no handoffs, which can lead to fumbles, as all football fans know. And third, we won't get into this in depth, but learning systems are distinguished by their use of an infrastructure which provides shared services to all the improvement cycles that are going on in the system. And this enables scalability and economy of scale. So we want to emphasize that this idea of continuity is one that leads to complete closed cycles of improvement, as opposed to what often happens, which is these cycles having points where they break. And it can break at the top, as you see here, or it could break anywhere. But in the example and with the methods we are trying to promote and introduce here today, the same learning community follows the learning cycle around from its initial step, which is studying what is happening now, which is performance to data, analyzing that data to create new knowledge, and then putting that knowledge into practice as this cycle progresses. The learning community is involved in all stages of the cycle. And what is not the learning health system approach is a situation where there are different groups or organizations or people with different backgrounds executing these different parts of the cycle, where people who might be called program evaluators are doing the performance to data part, where people who are called, for example, embedded researchers are doing the data knowledge part, and people who are change implementers are doing the knowledge to practice part. Now, people with different skills might be brought into play at different stages of the cycle, and there's nothing wrong with that, as long as there is this base group of people called the learning community, providing continuity throughout the process. If you don't have the learning community, you have breaks in the cycles, requiring handoffs, risking fumbles, and this is not an efficient way to proceed. The learning health community typically forms at the very early stage, that is the very beginning of a learning and improvement cycle. And this happens at, if you think of this as a clock face, at 5 o'clock on the clock, and follows, as I've said, the whole process around. And once established, these learning communities remain active. They might bring in, as I've said, people with different expertise to help them around the various stages of the learning cycle, but the community remains the basic driving force in what happens. So it's important to emphasize that these learning communities are very special kinds of communities or small organizations in and of themselves. They are profoundly collaboratives. They, first of all, include all of the stakeholders who have an interest, or even better, share a passion to address whatever the problem is that is bringing the community together, and with respect to which improvement is being sought. So they're pursuing a shared goal. They're trying to improve health or health care or something related to that, in pursuit of a goal they all share and feel strongly about. And these goals are best expressed as health improvement goals. If expressed as health improvement goals, they are much more likely to fuel the passion that drives the community and brings the community together in pursuing the learning cycle together. As collaboratives, the strategies that the learning community follows are co-produced, and as collaboratives, a special kind of facilitative, as opposed to top-down leadership, is required. And it's very, very important, even though the community will be composed of individuals representing many, many different groups, it is very important that no group dominates the community and becomes the driver and the sole driver of what happens. So this brings my remarks to a close. I will now turn things over to my colleague, Alexandra Vinson, and I think Jane is going to introduce her.
Actually, Chuck, before you go, I know you can't stay for the whole thing. We do have one question before you go, and
Sure.
We might have time for a couple more if you don't mind.
Sure.
In the chat, so learning community is the chassis of a three-wheeler where the three tires are D to K, K to P, P to D professionals, and LC people are managers and executives rather than purely technical, correct?
Is that in the chat?
It is in the chat. And
the chassis of a three-wheeler. Okay, well, this is a bit metaphoric, but let me see if I agree with it. Yeah, it certainly can be thought of as the chassis. It could also be thought of as the engine, because it's the driver and it's from where the energy comes. I would play out the idea of the three-wheeler, because the three stages of a learning cycle have to occur in harmony. But the difficulty I would have with calling it a three-wheeler is that these three stages, P to D, D to K, and K to P, do occur in sequence. They do not occur simultaneously, although there often isn't a clean break or differentiation between them. There is a clear sequence. And learning community people are managers and executives rather than purely technical. Yeah, and that's a good point being brought up. I would say that learning community people are representative of the full spectrum of stakeholders who must be engaged in addressing this problem. So they are not just managers and executives, and they are certainly not just technical, but as I think you're going to see in the examples, very typically there will be care providers, patients, family members of patients, representatives of community groups, and others. The learning community gains its power from this representation of all groups. So I love metaphors, and there were some nice insights in that one, but I did want to remark about a couple of places where the metaphor may not quite be in accord with what I think is a learning health system driven by learning communities. Do you want me to go ahead, Jane, and with the questions in the chat?
That would be great. I think the next one is just Josh reiterating learning community participation needs to be diverse. Sorry, and it's not just Josh, it's the great and marvelous Josh.
And Heather Martin said, I think everyone can participate in a learning community, not just managers and executives. Technical people help us get the data, implement the intervention, provide feedback on effectiveness, and there are lots of others. So Heather, thank you for giving a better answer to this question than I did.
All right.
Any other questions?
All right.
Okay.
Well,
okay.
Thank you very much for dropping in and starting us out.
And I'll stay, well, if you're talking about fumbles, you might as well also talk about kickoff. So
yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah, I'll stay around for a little while.
Oh, okay, great. All right. Well, next up is Alexandra. And I believe she's going to share her slides. There she is.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Alexandra Vincent, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Learning Health Sciences. Drawing on my background in social science, I'd like to talk with you about approaching learning community building by thinking about some of the high-level aspects of group culture. I will also link these high-level frameworks to more concrete frameworks so that you can see how you might get started with this work. I'll focus on group culture broadly and pull out one aspect of group culture that I think will be relevant to you as you begin your work, building a focus on health equity into your learning community. In Chuck's remarks, he described learning communities as collaboratives, people-centered groups. Because they are composed of a variety of stakeholders, everyone is pursuing a shared goal. Members of the learning community are fueled by passion to achieve their goal. Strategies for pursuing the community's goals are co-produced with the people who are affected by the problem the learning community is trying to address. The leader is primarily a facilitator, and no group or faction within the learning community dominates. Learning communities are consensus-oriented and are guided by their focus on a shared problem of interest. Ideally, a problem of interest that is salient to those who are affected by the certain health condition that the learning community is organized around. As you can see, this is a way of working together that will require every stakeholder to adjust their identity, to step up or step back, and for the group to develop new interactional processes. In short, a new sort of culture. As you build your learning community, it's wise to keep these group dynamics in mind as they can affect how the work of the learning community is accomplished. Building a learning community therefore requires taking an intentional approach, where group members are aware that community building is an active process that we all contribute to. Having frameworks can help with this process, and in this presentation, I'd like to share a few pertinent frameworks with you. Each of these frameworks foregrounds the choices a learning community makes as it forms, with the insight that if learning community builders approach these choices actively, there will be increased awareness about how the learning community's culture shapes the work that gets done. When starting a learning community, 3 central tasks emerge: identifying a shared problem of interest, identifying stakeholders, and developing community practices and processes. One way to make these tasks approachable is to turn them into questions. What work should the community do? Who should participate in this work? And how will we do this work together? In the remainder of this workshop, you'll learn about how learning communities have approached these questions as they form their communities, and you'll learn about the concrete considerations you'll need to make as you form your learning community. In my remarks, I'd like to focus on ways to approach this third question: how will we do this work together? Whenever we talk about working together, we get into the realm of social dynamics. A fundamental insight of social dynamics is that in a group, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There are some special emergent properties of groups, one of which is a group's culture, who we are and how we do things in our group. Think of it this way: each individual helps to perpetuate the group's culture through their participation, but the culture is not the property of any given individual. Likewise, an individual or small group might work to change a culture, but the impacts of those changes will touch everyone. We don't have perfect control over our group's cultures, even in a group that we create ourselves, like a new learning community. But I think that being aware of the different elements of culture can help with setting up standards for working together and common group practices, and can even come in handy if there's something about your learning community's culture that you need to change. The high-level point I'd like to make is that a group's culture is a form of infrastructure, in the sense that, like other infrastructures, it guides action and shapes interactions, and is thereby fundamentally constitutive of social relations. This means that culture is not an overlay on existing organizational processes, so be careful not to treat it as such. Because of these infrastructural properties of culture, considerations of group culture should be intentionally incorporated into learning community design. So what kind of culture do you want to build in your learning community? To think about this, it can be helpful to have a sense of what your options might be, such as a framework for how to think about group culture. I want to present a high-level framework that I developed that is informed by sociological theory and fleshed out in a study of learning networks, which are very similar to learning communities. Unlike frameworks of organizational culture that provide recommendations or instructions on how to build a functional group culture, I want to show you some of the more basic elements of culture. You can think of these as ingredients that all cultures have, and then you can make informed choices about the culture you would like to foster in your learning community. Culture is an abstract term that is both familiar but somehow difficult to break down. Here's how sociologists tend to approach the concept. First, you can think of culture as being a system of meaning. This refers to how we make meaning of the world around us, such as our beliefs about what is good or bad, our worldviews, our values, which help us decide what choices to make, and our priorities, what we think is important or not important. In the context of the learning networks I examined, one of their beliefs was that changing health outcomes should be the top priority. Their work included an explicit focus on values and coming to a shared understanding of what was important. And finally, they understood children's health as sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a sense of it being very precious and worth working hard to improve. So when we think about culture as shaping our systems of meaning, we're thinking about how the culture serves to orient members to the shared values and conventions of the group. We can also think about culture as establishing systems of social relations. This means that our culture contains guidelines and expectations for member behavior, and that these guidelines tend to promote group cohesion. Now, I won't dwell on this, but keep in mind that we are often members of several cultures, and the expectations for member behavior are probably not the same across all cultures and may come into conflict. We often navigate these different cultures seamlessly when we've had time to adjust to each one, but we have all probably noticed the potential for friction if we try to apply a strategy that works in one culture to our work in another culture. When we talk about systems of social relations, we're thinking of things that are probably pretty familiar: norms, roles, statuses, rituals, and even peer pressure. In the context of learning communities, in learning networks, one of their values is all teach, all learn. So if it's a value, why is it in this bucket? Well, the values a group has can shape how they set up their roles and norms. In learning networks and also in learning communities, it's important for all stakeholders to participate and for everyone's expertise to be acknowledged. That's the spirit of all teach, all learn, and it has implications for social relations. For example, if everyone's expertise matters, then it makes sense to give everyone equal status in the group or to distribute group roles based on someone's expertise rather than using their status as a proxy for expertise. Another way that groups relate is by having certain rituals, like a set structure for meetings so that everyone knows to expect a certain flow and rhythm, or having ceremonies or special recognitions of group members. These rituals help remind group members about their values, worldviews, and priorities, using the system of social relations to enforce the group's systems of meaning. Groups also use humor as a way to highlight things that are important. Sometimes in a subtle way, humor can be used as peer pressure to get everyone on the same page and create a sense of a shared experience by referring back to things that have happened in the past. Finally, we have culture as it is expressed in the forms of talk and codes of feeling used by group members. Expressive culture refers to the emotional aspects of group rituals and togetherness, and includes special language used by group members and other markers of their identity. Some examples of this include Ignite Talks, which are a short, motivating speech given by a community member that reminds the group of their common purpose, here drawing together expressive culture and culture as social relations. Expressive culture in the context of learning communities could also be the special language of improvement work that we use to talk about our initiatives and that we need to teach to new members of the learning community. So this is an overall framework for taking the familiar but vague concept of culture and breaking it down into its component parts. Each of these ways of thinking about culture contains things we are already doing. We all have values, norms, etc., even if we're not exactly aware of what they are. So raising our awareness of them will help us make active choices about the values, statuses, emotional aspects, rituals, and so on that we would like to build into our learning communities. Indeed, as sociologist Gary Fine wrote, it is through the practices of individuals working together, sharing interpretive frameworks, and constructing joint meaning that community and collective action is possible. Now that we've had a chance to think about culture broadly, I'd like to zoom in to a subset of culture, values, and how that has been developed within work on learning health systems and learning communities. I want to briefly discuss 3 frameworks that focus on design choices and network practices, 2 of which explicitly develop approaches to health equity in learning communities. For our working definition of health equity, we'll use a phrase from Parsons et al. The absence of socially unjust, unfair, and avoidable health disparities. Before we move into the frameworks, I want to highlight the words choices and practices. I'm highlighting these words to emphasize that there are many aspects of the learning community that you, as learning community builders, will need to approach with self-awareness and intention. You may not have total control over every structural or cultural aspect of your community, but you should start with a baseline assumption that every act of learning community building is a design choice, whether you are aware of it or not, and that every community action is a practice, whether you realize it or not. Using the frameworks discussed in this presentation will give you an idea of high-level principles of social groups that can inform your awareness and leadership, as well as your specific choices and practices related to one element of learning communities, the focus on equity. I use a focus on equity to both showcase 3 frameworks that may help you build equitable practices in your own networks, but also to model that the principles of group culture I just spoke about can apply to any domain of learning community work. First, I want to start out by showing you the learning health system core values. Whenever we talk about values, we're in the realm of systems of meaning, according to theories of culture. Our values help us figure out what is important to us and can guide the choices that we make. This set of values was developed by the Learning Health Community Organization and sets out a vision for what we should prioritize as we form learning communities to build learning health systems. These core values are person-focused care, privacy, inclusiveness, transparency, accessibility, adaptability, governance, cooperative and participatory leadership, and value. If you read our working definition of health equity in the pink box, in conversation with these core values, you might be able to see immediate implications for equity if we make a health system that operates in line with these values. Indeed, identifying the implications for health equity of each of these values was exactly what one team of authors did, and they produced a framework that can help us move from this high level and abstract argument for a values-driven approach down to the concrete. What structural, cultural, and behavioral elements do we need to build into our healthcare systems in order to achieve these values as they relate to equity? This framework, developed by Brooks and her colleagues, is called the PETAL framework. It is explicitly designed to be read in conversation with the LHS core values. In the diagram on the right side, you may not be able to read all of the text, but the light blue circle in the center maps the LHS core values to each petal of the framework. This mapping shows how the authors think we could practically apply the LHS core values to enhance equity in learning health systems. The PETAL acronym stands for Prioritize Health Equity, Engage the Community, Target Health Disparities, Act on the Data, and Learn and Improve. Each of these 5 dimensions is significantly fleshed out by the authors in the paper and provides a practical starting point for equity work in learning health systems. The second equity framework I'd like to tell you about is 7 core practices for the pursuit of equity through learning health systems. Again, you can see that I have practices highlighted, showing that this framework contains opportunities to actively choose how your learning community will operate, how members will work together, and what the learning community will incorporate into its focus areas. The authors of this framework argue that health systems need real transformation in order to achieve and sustain equity, but it can be hard to figure out where to start. In support of equity efforts, the authors propose 7 core practices for the pursuit of equity through a learning health system. Establish a principle, so position equity as an essential focus of the learning health system. Track data that matter to drive and sustain success. Ensure people with lived experience are leading the work. Co-produce, that is design, create, learn, act, and sustain together. Reallocate power and leadership across the system. And cultivate an environment and expectation for growth, or what we can call a growth mindset. Finally, it's important to catalyze change across systems that produce health. The authors of this, so now as I near the end of my talk, I want to return us to our original starting place, the question of how will we do this work together? I want to take a moment to show how the 4 frameworks I discussed today might relate to each other. As you can see, these frameworks are at different levels of abstraction, with the LHS core values and the infrastructural properties of culture being very high-level frameworks. These high-level frameworks can help guide development in a range of learning community domains because they provide general things to think about and point to choices that communities make as they form. However, the PETAL framework and the 7 core practices show what equity efforts in particular might look like in practice. These concrete frameworks model how you might bring the LHS core values and infrastructural properties of culture down to earth in other domains of learning community work. Now I want to briefly crosswalk these frameworks. And the point of doing this is to show you that no one framework comprehensively describes every important element of learning community work. As I mentioned before, the authors who developed the PETAL framework explicitly mapped connections between the LHS core values and their framework. And these arrows represent their mapping. My own mapping, I thought, prioritized health equity and position equity as an essential focus of the learning health system, might map to each other. Similarly, prioritizing health equity can map to leading from lived experience. Engaging the community maps to co-production, as well as to engaging beyond the healthcare system. Targeting health disparities can be accomplished by measuring for equity, and acting on the data and practicing a growth mindset go hand in hand for me. And finally, learning and improving also for me maps to practicing a growth mindset. Thinking about systems of meaning, well, if you position equity as an essential focus of the learning healthcare system, you're showing that that's a priority and that that's a value for the group. In addition, practicing a growth mindset is an expectation and is a value within learning communities. Systems of social relations map to things like leading from lived experience, so ensuring people with lived experience are leading the work, that they have status within the group and roles within the group that allow them to do that. Similar to co-production, redistributing power, thinking about who has the expertise to solve a certain problem, making sure that they can do that. And again, engaging beyond the healthcare system. I'm thinking very broadly about who counts as a stakeholder here. Taken together, well, some of you may identify additional connections between the frameworks, but this is my first attempt at showing their relations. You may be able to guide your work most effectively by combining these frameworks to pull out the relevant dimensions of a given learning community initiative. So taken together, these frameworks provide a range of answers to our key learning communities question: how will we do this work together? To wrap up, today I reviewed 4 frameworks for forming learning communities: the infrastructural properties of culture, the PEDAL framework, the LHS core values, and the 7 practices for pursuing equity through learning health systems. The 2 big points I want to leave you with are that a group's culture is a form of infrastructure, and it should be intentionally incorporated into learning community design, and that you should be making active choices about community practices and learning community design. When we fully appreciate the role of culture and social dynamics, including equity, in the project of building learning communities and improving healthcare, we are able to fully realize the learning health system as a socio-technical system, because we're giving equal attention to the unique social aspects of learning communities' work as we are to the unique data infrastructures and organizational processes that we describe as the technical side of this work. Finally, I leave you with a question for your consideration today. What kind of learning community do you want to build? Before I close, I'd like to acknowledge the funding I received from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute for the research I shared here, give image credit for the PEDAL diagram and slide template, and share the full citations for the frameworks I presented today. Thank you very much for being part of this workshop today. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Lisa Ferguson, Program Manager in the Department of Learning Health Sciences.
Actually,
You want to take questions, Jane?
yeah, thank you, Alexandra. We actually do have time for a couple of questions that people have put in the chat or comments. Victor said, how is a value of value? Josh replied, here's how value is defined. Value, the LHS will support learning activities that can serve to optimize both the quality and affordability of healthcare. The LHS will be efficient and seek to minimize financial, logistical, and other burdens associated with participation. So that was one comment. I didn't know if you would care to, say something about value. With those 2 comments.
Thanks,
before
Jane.
we go on. Yeah.
Yeah, I just say that I'm glad Josh weighed in, because he is, there's no better expert than Josh to address this, but yes, that's exactly right. When we think about affordability and quality, as well as efficiency and reducing financial burdens and reducing waste, that's when, and when we begin to prioritize that, that's when it becomes a value.
Okay, and then this culture plus pedal plus LHS slide is extremely useful for a diverse country like India. Thanks. And then went on to say, how do SDOH data integrate with this culture infrastructure?
Thank you. That's a great question. So SDOH is social determinants of health. So how does social determinants of health data integrate with this culture infrastructure? Well, they are operating at two different levels. So it can be a little bit tough to put them together beyond the ways that the PEDAL framework and the 7 practices for pursuing equity already pull these two things together. But the first thing is that social determinants of health are products of a system that is unjust. So if we want to reduce social determinants of health, we need to create a more just system. And one way to begin doing that is to become really clear about how the system works and how it may be producing injustice or unjust conditions in its current state. In order to get that level of clarity about organizational processes and organizational culture, first you need to have some kind of understanding of culture. The infrastructural properties of culture framework is not the only way to do this, but it is one relatively clear way to do it. And that's how I would link those two things together conceptually. I see Joss has also shared a direct link to the Brooks paper. Thank you very much. And thank you, Victor.
All right, thank you very much. We're going on schedule here. We're gonna try and keep going here. So now, next up is Lisa Ferguson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, we've heard from Chuck that the learning community is a key differentiator of learning health systems. And now we've heard from Alexandra about how learning community members can think and talk about explicitly what sort of culture they would like to foster as they begin to form a learning community. For the remainder of today's workshop now, we're going to focus on some of the practical work involved with forming and operationalizing a learning community. And the information that we're providing is based on our collective personal experiences working with learning communities. Of course, doing this work involves many specific tasks and activities. And what we've tried to do here is to provide another framework, but a different kind of framework. It may not be the framework, but at least it's a framework for helping to organize this work across phases and within categories such as people, process, technology, and policy. It's just a guide to help think about, flesh out, and organize the work. And flexibility is key as you go about this. First, a learning community doesn't spontaneously form, right? Generally, it starts with a small group of individuals who are interested in or passionate about addressing a problem. And then that group is usually who goes about the work of planning a learning community. So I'm going to talk about some of the key items to think about during planning, while my colleagues will then be talking later about the work involved in other phases of a learning community life cycle. In the planning phase, you're really trying to look ahead throughout all of the phases and trying to lay out a comprehensive path for the learning community. This is difficult because, as Chuck was saying, you're discovering and you don't know what you don't know at this point. The items listed on this slide don't represent the totality of all the work that might need to be done throughout the planning phase, but are likely, some of the most important things that should be taken into account during planning. And I'll walk through each of them today. I also want to note that the tasks and activities aren't being presented in any kind of particular order. So this is work that does not have to be done in a specific linear fashion. Rather, tasks and activities can often be done in parallel, and work can be accomplished in the order that makes sense for the learning community. So a learning community is formed first and foremost to work on a problem. A core group of individuals may already have a fully formed problem of interest in mind, or the learning community once formed could help develop the problem or refine it. Methods for defining a problem of interest don't have to be novel or unique to learning health systems work. There are some known methods used in other disciplines that could effectively be used to help either determine a problem of interest or later on help inform possible interventions. For example, current future state analysis, which is often used in business and other disciplines to kind of study current state and help organizations document and optimize their processes for better performance and outcomes, is also a tool that you could employ with a learning community to really help identify how great the gap might be between what's happening today and the vision for the future as it relates to the problem of interest. There are other methods that could be used to help determine a problem of interest in cases where it's not already predefined. You could use something like what's shown here on the screen, which we're calling a problem of interest prompt form. This is something that could be filled out by the learning community members in advance of the first meeting. And then you could take the information, analyze it, collate it, and then present it to the learning community for review, discussion, and consensus around the problem of interest. In cases where you might have a pretty well already defined problem of interest, the problem really should still be vetted by the learning community. For example, at the kickoff meeting, you could set aside a block of time for discussion about the problem of interest to confirm that it is indeed something that the members of the learning community want to collectively address. Before moving on from problem of interest, I did want to mention a couple things. First, not all problems are appropriate to address via a learning community. For example, if you have a problem that requires immediate attention or intervention, like a safety issue or something, then you would handle that through your existing management or operational channels. Learning communities are working on complex problems, and generally the work occurs over several months and most of the time years. Generally speaking, it's also important to have patients and caregivers as part of the learning community, so to facilitate inclusion of all perspectives. However, if a problem of interest is extremely sensitive, it might not make sense to include patients as part of the community. A quick example, Jane did some work with a fetal diagnostic center learning community, and they did not include patients in their community activities due to the highly emotional and painful nature involved with being a patient there. Another aspect of the work of the learning community pertains to the level of scale, and it goes hand in hand with the problem of interest. By scale, what we're talking about here is where is the work being done? So is the problem being worked on within a department inside a health system? Is it a work that's being done within a community or somewhere else? To kind of show you what I mean, I'm going to do a couple quick profiles of real learning communities of different scales. This first one is the Gastroenterology learning community, which we obviously shortened to GILC. This learning community was formed to address an issue related to improving bowel prep before colonoscopy. And this was a learning community that had about 25 stakeholders across 4 different sites where the procedures were being done. And in addition to the clinical team members, the learning community also had patient educators, IT department liaisons, folks from our department, patients. The learning community developed and implemented several interventions toward improving the problem of interest. And while this community is no longer active, and while we have not had the opportunity to prove this, we would like to think that with the infrastructure that was put in place for the GILC, for the work that they did here, if they wanted to work on another problem, they would be able to kind of re-energize that same infrastructure and get up and running quicker. This next learning community is much bigger in scale. This is the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest learning community, which is focused on out-of-hospital cardiac arrest rates. This learning community is bigger. It's composed of stakeholders that span the entire American Heart Association chain of survival. And so it has people from dispatch, police, EMT and paramedics, health system providers, and patient survivors across 2 counties in Michigan here. And this community started in 2018 and is still at work. And there will be more later on this in Michelle's presentation. The scale impacts several things that kind of require consideration when you're planning. One is just even the logistics involved in holding a meeting for the community. The larger the scale, the more stakeholders you're going to have, including more stakeholder types with differing schedules, and they could be spread across, a larger geography. And this will impact things like how often you meet, where you meet, what time you meet, how you meet, and so forth. In the early phases of planning, specific interventions aren't typically decided yet because the communities will be deciding that. However, the scale will almost certainly impact the amount of work that the learning community is going to have to undertake in terms of determining interventions, as well as the time it's going to take to get the implementation piece done. Another consideration of scale includes the technology and communication requirements for the learning community. It's less complex to enable these things for smaller communities than for a larger one. As an example, a small learning community might be able to simply make use of email for member communication, while a larger community might have to invest the time and effort in developing and maintaining a website to facilitate member awareness and communication. Okay, this is another thing that is good to think about when you're planning, and this is evaluation. You might want to think about in advance, what do you want to understand and measure or evaluate? The problem of interest will have some data associated with that, and we'll get to that in a second. But you may also be interested in evaluating the learning community itself. What were the experiences of learning community members and so forth? And think about the possible reasons or purposes that you might want to have some of these metrics for evaluation, whether it be publications, reports, if you have external funders. Are you doing research or a study? Do you want to use the information for communicating progress to the members and so forth? And if the learning community doesn't really think about these things in advance and have a plan to evaluate, there could be missed opportunities, especially opportunities for improvement. One community I worked with actually had included a list of success factors for the learning community as part of their original charter, which was very great, but then didn't take the additional steps of implementing an evaluation process for assessing the factors throughout the learning community effort. So it wasn't until the end of the activities that these things were revisited as part of member interviews, which kind of left some gaps and missed opportunities for improvement. Funding's another big thing to think through when you're planning. This has impacts on the learning community work and sustainability. And there's some questions on the slide that you might want to consider and ask yourself. Are we going to get funding? Where would we get it from? How long would we have it? If you don't have supplemental funding available, the work will essentially be in-kind volunteer effort provided by the members of the learning community, and that needs to be accounted for upfront in terms of setting expectations regarding member availability and their ability to participate in the activities of the learning community. In addition, think about whether there are technology or data needs that might cost money, or anything that might cost money. Is the learning community going to have to rely on external groups to provide services, and are there costs associated with that? Funding also impacts the work of the learning community in terms of what might be able to accomplish and over what time frame. So work might move faster, for example, if funding is available and the members can prioritize the work over non-funded work that they might be doing. I need lots of exclamation points on this next item, which is data. The availability of and access to relevant data is one of the most challenging, I've found anyway, yet important aspects of learning community work. The data is what supports the picture of the impact of the problem now and what it's going to look like post-intervention. And you really should think about this as soon as you can, even if you're not exactly sure what the interventions will be. You know, trying to think through the questions shown here really will help. Another experience I had, I was involved in a learning community that quickly discovered they didn't have access to appropriate data for their problem of interest. And as a result, they did make the decision to take on a significant amount of unplanned work to standardize data points, combine and collate data from different systems, and even create a data mart, which took an extraordinary amount of time. And they also decided that despite the issues they knew they had with the data, they were going to go ahead and move ahead and do the work of selecting and implementing various interventions that they thought would help with the problem of interest. Unfortunately, because they didn't have appropriate data before and after, it was impossible really to determine the effects of the interventions in that way. They were able to conduct some patient surveys to assess the new interventions, which provided some qualitative data, but purely quantitative data was not available due to these issues. So ideally, the community would have solved these data issues before embarking on the work of developing and implementing their interventions. Stakeholders, another giant part of thinking about planning a learning community. You want a diverse community that represents all possible perspectives pertaining to the problem of interest. You could start with an initial list of individuals who are directly involved with the problem of interest and continue to expand your list from there. Think outside the box for other potential stakeholders that you might not have thought of right away, depending on the work of whatever the learning community is doing. This might include payers or individuals from the quality department or specific domain experts and so forth. And be sure to include patients or caregivers unless it's a situation like I described earlier. And then make sure to vet that list with the entire community. The structure of the learning community is another planning piece. Often learning communities are structured in a way such that you have the whole community itself, then you have a smaller subset of the learning community, sometimes referred to as the core planning or core leadership team, and that team's helping with the planning, administration, infrastructure, and management activities associated with the learning community. And then there's also work groups, also a subset of the larger group, but they're focused on specific interventions and topics of interest related to the learning community work. There's also a governance component having to do with the vision, mission, and charter for the learning community, and Jane will be talking more about that. And then it's never too early to think about sustainability. It's not something that you want to not think about until kind of the end. So especially if you want to keep things going. So a final comment I have is that while this is a lot to think through, you aren't going to have a solid plan for everything before you start, so don't let that hold things up. Just instead, thinking about these things at least allows the community to make informed decisions rather than getting surprised or having the numerous, I wish we would have thought of that before now moments. So now that we've had a chance to think about planning, next up is Jane, who's going to talk about the practical work of getting the learning community up and running. Jane?
All right, thank you. All right, let me just start by saying Lisa is a brilliant planner. So, the initiation phase is almost part of the planning phase. It's really planning for your community to launch, to start. So anyway, my pre-pandemic picture, I went flaming gray over this last year and a half. Had a little before, but not this much. Anyway, so I wanted to recenter ourselves back to Alexandra's talk. So a learning community is at its core a human system. So while you are juggling the coordination of technology, processes, and policies in all phases, we have to remember that the community is run by, with, and for individuals who contribute their enthusiasm, energy, and resources to the shared goals of the group. In the initiation phase, that means establishing structures that will set the stage for a community to grow and for everyone to succeed. So the kickoff meeting is the launch, and it's kind of think about all of the times that you have felt welcome, included, and heard. What made that possible? For a learning community launch to be successful and to start everyone on the best path, there are many small but important details that can make a difference and bridge between planning and being able to make implementation strategies and make progress on goals later on. The kickoff meeting sets the tone as you begin to coalesce around shared goals and socialize LHS concepts. And here are some logistics to consider. Some of these Lisa has gone through, but I'd like to emphasize that setting up ground rules for how the group wants to interact and for surveying the group for common themes can be very helpful in unifying exercises. So you might think, as Lisa said, you have a problem of interest. And as Douglas said, I think in the chat, that maybe it turns out not to be the problem of interest, or maybe you have to dig a little deeper and there's really something behind what they're saying is the problem. So you have to dig deeper, and we can talk more about Doug's question at the end. Eventually, but still in the developing phase of your learning community, you may find it helpful to create a mission statement and to build a charter that clarifies roles and responsibilities. Examples of these can be found in the department's practical guide, Operationalizing a Learning Community. And we have it listed in the last slide, that and some other resources. So you'll have a chance to take a look at that and access to that. Another aspect of the initiation phase is to have general infrastructure in place to support the learning community. You may want to consider or adjust all of those things that Lisa talked about: hardware and software, data tools, document storage, because now you're beginning to make decisions as a team. So, you know, you have to have flexibility to adjust what you need. And also really, I think we can't emphasize enough the importance of who is your learning community. Is it a small department learning community? Is it a large regional one? You know, that each one, each learning community, like each group of people anywhere, and what their goals are and things like that are unique, and they have some things in common, but they also, you have to tailor it for your particular community. Finally, for my brief part, some of the challenges you will encounter during the initiation phase are related to physical location, time scarcity, and shifting priorities. So again, all the things that you think about with planning, the tech requirements, you know, hosting meetings at times to accommodate crazy schedules. Do you need stipends for some community members who otherwise wouldn't have access to childcare in order to participate, things like that. So, and you want to build in redundancy with roles that people are contributing to, which I think Michelle talks about a bit, and document your processes and policies, and most of all, convey enthusiasm to motivate and encourage your team. And with that, I will gladly pass the microphone over to Michelle, who will talk about implementation.
Thank you, Jane. And even though initiation is brief, I don't think it should be discounted, because it really is a crucial part of getting participants in a learning community really excited about the work that they're getting ready to pursue. So implementation is the next step as the stakeholders, they work to decide what they'd like to do.
Excuse me, I think I see the speaker notes. So,
Oh, let me share this. Sorry.
it's good.
So they're working to decide and tackle the problem of interest. And this is really the nuts and bolts of the work. It's the bulk of the work that is done in the learning community. And it really takes, it can take months. And as Lisa said, to years. I'm involved in the out of hospital cardiac arrest learning community, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And this is the 3rd year, and we're now getting to our first implementation. So consider this implementation phase of operationalizing a learning community as really the beginning once this kickoff meeting has occurred. And there's certain components of the process, technology, people, and policy that you have to think through for implementation. There is some overlap in the tasks and activities from initiation, but implementation is really the phase of the work that decides on first the process, which is the intervention or interventions. It decides on how the rollout will occur. It considers what the data shows and establishes how success is measured. So that's the technology part of things. There's also additional considerations such as how frequent the group should meet, what will be the leadership and makeup of the work groups, and how will progress be communicated with stakeholders. So the people are integral to the implementation in a learning community. And finally, for policy, how the cycle can be adjusted for continuous improvement. So the implementation phase of operationalizing represents the major work of the learning community. So learning community members' stakeholder commitment is really key in this process of deciding on an intervention. Nothing gets done if your stakeholders are not committed. But how do you keep them committed? So our experience shows that these are 3 top considerations to think through regarding stakeholder commitment. So engagement and teamwork, progress reports, and work group activities. First, engagement and teamwork. In this area, the learning community should consider how do you want to manage member engagement? So I think Lisa talked a little bit about this. How often do you want to meet? So what policies do you want to consider around those learning community meetings? Considering your stakeholders' commitments. When you have a really, really diverse group, especially a larger one that spans, in one of the cases she referred to, across counties, along a huge chain of survival where you have hundreds of participants. Sometimes the meetings have at minimum 60, 70 people attending. You want to decide how often do you want to meet? What are these people's time commitment? How can you keep them consistently engaged? So think through and decide on the following things, like what would be appropriate times, frequency of the meetings, considering stakeholder schedules, like I said, deciding how often they should meet as a whole, and then also deciding how they should meet as work groups. So how can they break down into smaller groups that tackle maybe a particular part of the intervention? These are key considerations. And work groups, they play a really major role in sustaining membership engagement. Often the work groups select one of the learning community's key objectives, and they work on that as a supplemental approach to the problem of interest. So the work groups work, it's often formed around a particular objective, and it ends up being a co-intervention of the learning community. You also want to consider how do you want to engage with non-learning community experts, and what format the meeting would take. So if you want to be in person, if you want to be online, if you want to alternate or have a mix of both, have an in-person meeting and a hybrid meeting really in person, and then have some people join online as well. These might sound like really minor considerations, but they're all important when it comes to engaging stakeholders. So in the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest learning community, for example, as a practical example, At their second meeting after the launch, they decided to have quarterly meetings. And then they also agreed to start each meeting with a survivor story. So survivors, it's only 8% of people who suffer sudden cardiac arrest outside of a hospital setting. Only 8% of them survive. So it's very rare to get a survivor to speak. And so they decided, even though it sounds like a really small detail, it's a useful tactic that helps ground the group in the problem of interest of sudden cardiac arrest. And this is like our Ignite talk, referring back to what Alexandra talked about earlier. This is what helps keep our group grounded in the fact that, hey, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase the number of people who survive a sudden cardiac arrest, since the number of survivors is so low at the moment. So while the core project staff for the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest learning community, we facilitated the meetings, learning community stakeholders, they were the ones identifying the sudden cardiac arrest survivors that they knew of, and then staff would reach out and contact them about presenting at the quarterly meeting, one story each meeting. The second phase of the learning community engagement is reporting on progress. That's another phase in establishing member commitment. What mechanism and how often should there be an overall update to learning community members? Communicating regularly with stakeholders is really a helpful strategy to update them on the wins and the challenges of the community. Often many stakeholders, they may not be directly executing the intervention and may not be aware of how much progress is being made or what difficulties there are. So keeping them in the loop beyond the regular meetings is helpful and sustains engagement and commitment. Depending on the level of stakeholder engagement, there are many useful engagement strategies and tools that you can use to share progress. This is one such example. Every learning community should have a key contact list. This is an example of a contact list. It was kept by the GI learning community that Lisa spoke about a little earlier. And then in the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, we generate a newsletter on a quarterly basis, and we share with the members where we are. We even talk about the learning health system approach that we're using, like which step we are on the cycle. And we also developed a very simple website, but a learning community, this is just one approach. I mean, people can get as complex as they want when you're developing your own learning community or participating in it. So in the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest case, we've developed a simple website that shares information, relevant news, and developments in the field of sudden cardiac arrest. And finally, work group participation. This is really key. You want learning community stakeholders to join the work groups, because like I mentioned, the work groups often lead co-interventions of the learning community's work. And then I'll show some examples ahead. Policies you should consider are: how is leadership of the work groups decided? What is the process for aligning the goals of the work group activities with that of the larger learning community? Aligning the activities of the work groups become most important as you think through possible interventions for the problem of interest. And there should be a plan developed in the charter for selecting work group leadership, coordinating work group membership, and developing a transition plan for both leaders and members. In the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest learning community, we've had experiences of leaders leaving the community. And what has worked well for us is having co-leadership of the work groups. So having two co-chairs, that balances when maybe one person has a busy schedule, the other can still convene and lead the work group's meetings or their activities. And it also helps if a co-chair has to leave leadership on short notice due to other commitments, or they no longer work at the organization they're representing. And in a case like that, there is at least one other leader up to speed on the group's activities until another co-chair is decided on. So after establishing the top considerations for stakeholder commitment, the next step is identifying an intervention. Stakeholders in the learning community are the people key to the problem of interest, and many may have various ideas on what should be done to tackle the problem of interest after they consider the data. So making a list of possible interventions and then discussing them is the first step before a decision should be made on what should be pursued first. There is no hard and fast rule on this process, so I'm just putting that out there right now. Doing what works best for your learning community, sometimes a learn as you go process, so be comfortable in uncertainty. Some people decide to go for the low-hanging fruit, an intervention that can start immediately and be concluded quickly. Others decide to go for the biggest, boldest intervention. So how a learning community makes their decision will depend on matters like available funding, stakeholder consensus, and time to plan, time to roll out. Selecting an intervention will require an agreement from a group of stakeholders that often have very diverse ideas and representation. There are a few models that can be used to decide on an intervention. Consensus, which is not the same and should not be confused with unanimity. And actually, I'm not sure unanimity is really possible in a group that is as diverse as the learning community. There's also a majority vote, or there could be intervention decision-making where learning community leadership decides, and that's a top-down approach, and that's not the best process. And in fact, I would advise against it based on my experience. So the method your learning community will use for selecting an intervention should be discussed ahead of the implementation phase and made part of the policy regarding the community's decision-making process. For the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, the consensus decision-making approach has worked as a good model to use when deciding on an intervention. And this kind of decision-making, which is well written about in evidence-based decision-making, it refers to having team members, or in this case, learning community stakeholders, discussing whether decisions can be reached by consensus in the following suggested ways. So where a stakeholder can say either, I am at least 70% comfortable with or in favor of this decision, and I will be 100% committed to it. Or they might say, I'm 60% comfortable with the decision, but I still have reservations. I need more information, but I'm responsible for finding the information I need. Or I'm less than 50% comfortable with the decision, and I'm responsible for presenting an alternative solution. The 70% comfortable choice is really a good place to aim for. The intervention plan should also include a risk mitigation process, which would entail developing options and actions to enhance opportunities and reduce threats to the execution of the intervention, so like a SWOT analysis. And then in terms of the rollout, you should rely heavily on the multi-stakeholder participation and expertise of the learning community participants to drive the intervention's launch. So work groups which I come right back to, they're very critical because their activities may be supplementing the launch. It's always useful to keep in mind that the actual launch and intervention, regardless of how it was decided on, it's driven by the stakeholders themselves. They are the champions of the intervention and its related activities. And this is as a practical example, this is a simple log tracking suggested interventions could be used. That's having a tool like this could be useful for a learning community, or you can even get more complex in tracking what suggested interventions were. This is important because I think you want to include the main intervention, but activities undertaken by the work groups that supports the overall implementation of the learning community should also be tracked. And then you can have some of the suggested interventions, you keep them on the log, and you can use them later after you finish your initial implementation. And then I have the examples I talked about from the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, where we have our work groups. So the main learning community, which we are working on developing a public awareness campaign on what 2 steps you can take at home if you witness a sudden cardiac arrest of a loved one. The AED work group, which is currently working, they're developing a mapping system of where public AEDs are located across Washtenaw and Livingston counties in Michigan. And the goal is to identify areas across the counties where data shows people are at highest risk for sudden cardiac arrest, and then they determine where the public AEDs are located in those areas and which places have gaps. So that's at the same time we're having this public awareness campaign ongoing. Then we have the community engagement work group, which is focused heavily on bystander, and bystanders are community witnesses, that what is their willingness and responsiveness and knowing what to do if they see someone suffering a sudden cardiac arrest. And then there's also a recovery and support work group that's focused on organizing recognition and celebration of sudden cardiac arrest survivors and those who, the bystanders who might have started CPR and called 911 and helped that person become a survivor, essentially. Now, how will the learning community and its stakeholders know what is working and what is not, and what to do for improvement? Evaluation is often overlooked, but it should be key to the work of the learning community's implementation. So there are things like stakeholder commitment and engagement, which are, you can measure that relatively easily by looking at the numbers, who attends, who doesn't attend, how committed are they, and how active they are. But demonstrating the impact of the intervention and the value of it being carried out by a learning community, it's very hard to do. And it requires the learning community to decide on what metrics determine success and shows impact. Because this concept is newer and learning communities can be so diverse, deciding on the best measurement principles will be learning community specific. It is unlikely we may ever end up at a place where there's a one-size-fits-all approach regarding assessment and measurement standards when it comes to learning community work, but it's important that we should be evaluating. So here is an example of a patient-informed measurement principle proposed by Okun and Goodwin that should be used to create patient-centered health measures in a learning community with patients. So people should understand what the measurement means. It should answer the question asked in an efficient manner that is relevant, teaches, and demonstrates actions to change. Finally, implementation in a learning community faces many challenges. But in my experience, there's some key elements that often come up. So first, data standardization. When a wide range of institutions collect data, there's often a challenge of how the data flows among these entities in a cohesive or standardized way. And then when you add in community participation and the additional challenges, they get amplified. For example, we've been finding in the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest community, the lack of a standardized format in collecting certain demographics like race and ethnicity and language from participants. That presents more challenges in collecting the data. Research has shown that explicitly expressing the rationale for the data collection may improve the situation, but there's still like additional challenges such as technology constraints, sometimes internal resistance at the organizational level. The second challenge is organizational buy-in. Organizations represented in the learning community may, one, not understand the learning health system model and therefore may not see the value of the multi-stakeholder approach of a learning community. And during implementation, the value of how this multi-stakeholder approach will lend itself to the effectiveness of an intervention, that should be constantly re-emphasized, and there should be direct outreach from the leadership of the learning community to the leadership level of each organization that has a participant involved, and even the individuals, because in our case, like the out-of-hospital learning community, we actually have community members who are survivors as part of that. That has worked well for the OHCA learning community, and I would say it's a good suggestion if you're forming a learning community. And finally, membership turnover. I talked a little bit about that. It is inevitable that people will change positions, switch jobs, retire, etc. And if they are the representatives of the organization, then having that established relationship with organizational leadership, it really comes in useful. Because leadership has buy-in and they see the value of the learning community, there usually is someone new appointed to replace the outgoing representative. So speaking from experience, I can say for the out-of-hospital learning community in its third year, we've seen quite a bit of turnover. What we found is that the outgoing member usually reaches out to say, hey, I'll be changing positions or leaving the organization, and this is who will replace me. I will get them up to speed on the work we're doing. And having that smooth transition is essential when it comes to implementation because it allows for continuity. So to wrap up, the key takeaways in the implement phase are work to keep stakeholders engaged and committed, decide on and launch an intervention or interventions, and then assess success, make improvements as you go along, and then think through possible challenges you may encounter, try to plan ahead as best as possible. Thank you. I'll hand it over back to Jane.
All right, thank you. Well, this is question and answer. We're just a smidge behind, but that's okay. Why don't we take like 5 or 6 minutes for any questions or discussion before we take a break. So let's see, I guess there's some things in the chat. Let's see. I think Doug kind of, I'm sorry, I don't know if it's Doug or Douglas Barnaby, kind of started out with the problem of interest. I don't know if you would like to, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but if you'd like to jump in.
It's much easier just to ask the question. So the
Okay.
problem I'm facing a lot of times is, you know, executive leadership has a perception that this is the problem, and then frontline providers think that this is the real problem, and then the data people assume it's the data is the problem, and the predictive modelers think they can come up with a new predictive model that'll fix the problem. And then ultimately we find out that it's nothing that anybody's mentioned. So to convene the stakeholders, I'm always curious. I think, Lisa, we talked about this at one point, but how much during the planning phase do you try to narrow the scope to make sure that you have the right community to define the problem more clearly? So it's really I guess a scoping question, in that how much preliminary work do you need to pick the optimal learning community?
Can I jump in while Lisa ponders that? And I'm just thinking, would it be helpful to think what is the outcome that you're looking for rather than what's the problem? Because if you ask what outcome, I wonder if that would change who's at the table.
I think it does change. So I don't want to get too deep into metaphors, but if your learning community is a bunch of hammers, then everything's going to look like a nail. So we have a very robust machine learning AI group that is very much convinced that all we need is a better chunk of data and a better predictive model, and we'll fix whatever problem we're trying to address. Whereas I would say 99% of the time, if we would just use our existing model and focus on the implementation side of things, we would achieve the goal. So if I pack the learning community with people that have one approach to a solution, and really the problem is not what their expertise is in, we can get down a dark alleyway and end up at the end of it saying that we're not actually fixing the problem that exists. We're fixing the one that we like to fix. So I guess, I'm trying to form this learning community right now around patient deterioration, and the machine learning people are clamoring to be let in, and I'm kind of nudging the other side of the equation to weigh in more on the implementation science, improvement people, systems engineers, because I think, and this is the worst part, like my bias is creeping in too. So, maybe I'm wrong and it is just a better machine learning model, but I guess I'm just trying to figure out like how much preliminary work is helpful to both narrow the scope enough, but not prejudge what the solution is going to be. And there's probably no answer, I realize, but it's my thing right now.
I would like to say it's remarkable that you have a situation where you're trying to keep some of the data people back. It's like usually we're trying to say, please come.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, I don't really have a really good answer for that. Based on my experience, I would say that we have cycled through different stakeholders depending on what's going on. But the original determination of the problem was really, it was formed by the clinicians for the most part. And then, you know, I was describing, we had a lot of challenges then with getting data. They were sure they had these problems and trying to get data to, first of all, show that that was a problem, and then after interventions to then show that it had improved the problem. That's where we ran into some real issues. So I don't know. I mean, that's a hard one, because you don't want to hold things back. You want to get going, but you also don't want to get going in the wrong, you know, in the wrong way either. So
Yeah.
that's hard.
Yeah. I'm going to switch because we're going to wrap it up real quickly, but we will have time to talk more issues that come up in the later half. But and I'm sorry if I don't get your name right, but Mayank asked about LHSs in Japan or anywhere else in Asia. And I'm sorry, since I'm in the MC spot, I'm now going to call a friend and ask Josh, put Josh on the spot and ask if he has any knowledge of any groups in Asia.
Yeah, I think, as you pointed out, there are articles in the LHS journal about learning health systems in Japan. In Asia, we have worked with groups in Taiwan and Japan from government agencies that I think are sort of tantamount to what the Agency for Healthcare for Research and Quality, ARC, is here, that have been involved in that kind of work. And more generally, if you want to look at it, our journal has some very interesting international. We have the Swiss learning health system covered there, and we have other international efforts that might be of interest. I'm just trying to read your question exactly. Reports in the journal, a great way to see decisions in other countries. You know, I guess I'll say international or multinational efforts get very interesting too. So there have been efforts across several countries in Europe. I think when countries try to work together, even people from different cultures try to work together, that's where you get some really interesting outcomes. So I hope that's a helpful starting point. And I'll defer to other people on this meeting who are more involved with learning communities directly.
Yeah, and I know Chuck Friedman has been, he was invited to Saudi Arabia to talk about learning health systems. I think that was right as the pandemic was going to hit. So I don't think that trip took place. We have hosted people from the University of Peking to learn more about, they wanted to learn more about learning health systems, and that was very interesting too. So there does seem to be a lot of international interest, not just in, you know, North America or Western Europe. So with that, we're going to take a 10-minute break. It is now 2:35, so we will reconvene at 2:45. All right. So thanks, everyone. Thank you for continuing the conversation in chat, and thanks everybody, Josh and Alexandra and everybody else for jumping in too. Let's see. Okay. I think this will do it. You ever feel like you need 5 screens?
Every day, Jane.
All right. We got our coffee break or whatever break. Okay, small group thing. So I don't know who had time to read it, the scenarios. You're only going to participate in one. I'm just going to quickly say that if somebody can kind of keep track of time, if somebody could take notes and somebody could be a reporter back and you can share, or, you know, try and decide quickly who's going to do what, because we're only going to have 25 minutes. We're going to cut it down a little bit so we have more time to talk. So be mindful of the time, but don't feel rushed. If you guys want to continue your chat conversation or talk about some of the issues you're dealing with for other people's ideas, that's just as well, if not better. So does anybody have any pressing questions before we just kind of get launched in? It won't be recorded, and it says if you have any questions, you all can always get back to the main room as well, the main Zoom room. So any questions?
I have a question. This is Janie Lee from the University of Washington. I just have a quick question. It looks like there's 3 parallel breakout sessions. I don't actually know which one I've been assigned to, or is this?
You know what? Nobody does. I think we're going to let Zoom kind of sort everybody.
Okay.
The sorting hat is Zoom today.
Okay, so we'll magically end up in a room and then we'll commence this process that is out.
Yep. And then Kathy will pull all of us back for discussion when it's time.
Correct. You all come back in 25 minutes. If for any reason anybody gets lost, you can go back to the main room and I'll find you and then I'll send you to a room or something. Not to worry. Okay, so I'm going to open up the rooms now. Hopefully you should all get to a room.
Thank you. So group 3, which question did you do? A breakout.
Yeah, hi, Jane.
Hi.
Yeah, hi, Jane. We did scenario A, planning for a learning community.
Okay. Do you want to jump in and give a very brief, you know, kind of what you took away, what some of your issues were and how you solved them or addressed them?
I can summarize our discussion.
Okay.
So, you know, based on the 15, 20 minutes or so we had, in focusing, our group wanted to think about who is going to be the scope for solving the problem and kind of how to get the ball rolling for starting the learning community. And so we established that the main problem we're looking at was the hemoglobin values becoming more erratic during the pandemic. We established our initial stakeholder list, probably our main stakeholder list being our care providers, our patients, data people, potentially others in leadership at our organization, and potentially community contacts. That might involve like teachers in the community, experts on nutrition, or food suppliers in this situation, if there's some imbalance there. We talked kind of about, scrolling down here, so we talked about stakeholders. So our scale was, we talked back and forth about this a little bit. I think the initial idea is we would start a little bit small and start with looking through our initial results we've gotten so far and look at a retrospective data analysis to look at the patients who are reporting elevated or erratic results of their hemoglobin to see if it was hitting a particular people in our patient population, if there was some trends in that initial patient population. Also of interest to see if there was, if potentially that population didn't have access to things like food or potentially exercise during the pandemic. And our idea was to start retrospectively, then start with a smaller group, potentially interviewing some patients as well, and then also rolling out throughout the hospital wide and then potentially community wide as well. Okay, and I'll go to the last few questions, and then I can let some of my other team members join in if they want to. So in terms of infrastructure, we talked about, or I should say, in stakeholders, we talked about the importance of following, the nutrition cycle and following how the data is recorded from start to finish to make sure that everyone who's involved would be involved. And then we also discussed briefly potentially considering policymakers once we have some sort of conclusion potentially. On infrastructure, we talked about the importance of an evaluation of the current culture or current patient population demographics and a literature review before any sort of intervention to see if there was other potential reasons for the spikes of hemoglobin, before we did our intervention. but then also establishing time and money set aside so that we could dedicate to review this problem, and then start to consider the potential for any sort of process changes, measurement like new data fields in our data collection instruments or EHR. The last two questions cover, for consensus, we talked about the importance of early on defining the scope, defining the problem, and then starting to map out the phases of our project, but also defining the decision-making process. So if we were going to operate on full team consensus, majority consensus, or having one leader who makes the final determination, just having that determined early on helps facilitate consensus long-term. And then last question on how we would communicate this information. We talked about a few ideas briefly, potentially publishing and disseminating the results, professional journals, communicating between like internal in our hospital unit or community leaders, or developing some presentation or report to share and disseminate. So that's our summary. I'll let some of our other team members jump in briefly if they want to add anything to that summary.
Okay, was it difficult to come up with some of these things? Did it spur discussion at all of anything that you are going through in your organizations?
I think I felt each one of us is coming from a different background. So to get the same perception in answering the question, that was the challenge, which is, I think that's the first thing when you get to establish a learning community. So you buffer the effect of everybody is coming in, but every value, every point is valuable to the discussion. So how we saw things, it was a reflection of our different background.
Okay. Okay. Was anything controversial at all? If not, we'll have to add some in for next time.
Well, we need more time to have a time to discuss and disagree, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
that's fair.
I agree with that because we spent a fair amount of time trying to understand each other's perspectives. That was probably the first quarter or so of the time.
Yeah,
and
that's good.
And so yeah, having a little bit extra time would be helpful for next.
I'll be honest with you, in terms of feedback about the scenario itself, it seemed like a lot of the potential issues related to this particular scenario could not be addressed within a health system. And so, a lot of it had to do with public health and things that were happening outside. And so I don't know if you wanted to do that, to highlight that many important problems are not contained within a health system, or if you want a scenario where you can more focus on what do you need to do within a health system, then I might suggest revising it. It just depends on your goals.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we tried to do kind of a variety because there are so many different kinds of learning health systems kind of within and without. Like Michelle has a very outward focusing one, the Blue Cross, Blue Shields, or the learning networks that Alexandra works with are very outward focused and stuff like that, but thank you. So let's see, which group did the second scenario? I know the first group did, but did the other group, the third or fourth group do? No, Jordan, what group were you in? You were in the third?
We were third.
Okay, did the fourth group do the second one? Okay.
No, we did the same one too. Scenario A.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, then let's have you guys do it. So, did you have anything different, like for your scope and how did you think about the problem?
I think we approached it very similarly. I think we came up with a couple more stakeholders that we thought about. For example, reaching out to primary care physicians involved or health professionals involved with the care of the child. Also, thinking about the mental health component, reaching out to psychologists, psychiatrists, or social workers that might be involved with the care. As well as thinking about the environment of this group. So whether it be school-related professionals that may be interacting with the kids, also thinking about the lab personnel and the facilities, as far as just making sure that we were understanding the lab tests that were done and how the values were being considered. The scale in terms of, focusing on the community level and being able to understand the community in which the kids and the family and the parents interact in. Let's see. We came up with how to identify any missing key stakeholders, just like Jordan mentioned in his group, about asking the people that we were connecting with and to see if they had other ideas, other people to involve, including, considering what the person's situation is, if they're in foster care, if there are other services that the person is tapping into or the family members are tapping into. As far as infrastructure, we thought about, email, phone calls, Zooms, in person, all sort of thinking about, as possibilities, but also evaluating, what's available to the families and the environment that they're in. Can we come up with different ideas of how to reach people if they don't have a phone, or they cannot do a Zoom, or cannot be in an in-person scenario. And then finally, getting consensus, thinking about, implementation of polls and surveys, considering autonomy so that there's the polls are anonymous and people feel comfortable answering them or giving us more feedback. And then finally, reaching out in terms of communication, to add to Jordan's list, consider possible professional societies, publications, different forms of media, social media, professional societies that could help us bring forth this issue that we're trying to resolve.
Okay, all right. Any questions by anybody else or issues? Before we move on, thank you very much. That was very complete, both of you. You guys did a good job. That was the one with the most questions. So I'm impressed two people chose that, or two groups chose that one. All right, so group one chose scenario B, and if you want to go ahead.
Hi, so we chose scenario B, which is about initiating a learning community. It's really looking at a community with where there's a high prevalence of type 2 diabetes in a local community, and trying to figure out how to bring all the stakeholders together to do something about it. The first question is, what are some of the challenges in the scenario? And we viewed, there wasn't very good attendance at the meetings, and people aren't really getting that engaged. And the question is, what are the challenges? We said, maybe the leadership style of the medical director, having a clear and concise purpose, and sort of a what's in it for me for each of the stakeholders to get what they may get out of it. Something as simple as, what time of day is the meeting? And someone in our group gave an example of their group meets at 4 o'clock every Friday afternoon, which might force people to stay at work on Friday afternoon, but might not always be the best time. Then we asked, what are some things that can be done to address these challenges? We suggested, at least a very Michigan solution, is send a doodle poll to find out when people would like to meet again, if there's a better time. Really try to get a sense better of what the exact problems they're looking at are, and how would they really help people with this. Having the two other key people in the group speak with the medical director about their style would be valuable. The blustery style of the medical director might not be working, and trying to work on that, giving constructive feedback, constructive criticism. Just asking the members directly, why aren't they going? You know, there's nothing wrong with sending out an email and put a subject line email, action required. You know, let us know why you're not going. Why aren't you engaged? Possibly trying to find even a higher up leader for buy-in, or a higher up person for buy-in. And finally, I mean, this is really about, you know, the impacts of diabetes in a community. So bring in more people from the community itself, you know, in a sense, the neighbors, the people who live there, the patients, the families, bring them in, and, you know, maybe have some compelling stories. There might be some compelling statistics to get involved, but there also might be some real heartfelt stories about how diabetes affected someone's life, or that kind of thing that might really touch heart, pull on the heartstrings and get people engaged for that reason. What are some methods to specifically re-engage the stakeholders? I guess this kind of overlaps with things that can be done to address the challenges, but discuss the format of the meeting and why it is, you know, is it the format effective? Is it engaging people enough? Is it a top-down thing where they're talking at you and people aren't feeling any reason to go? Is it more collaborative? You know, re-engagement might mean needing to see progress, and take this very big idea like, well, we're going to try to reduce type 2 diabetes over time. That's a huge thing. You know, can you find smaller components of the problem and help people engage in making real progress on a small piece of the puzzle? So break into small work groups with much more manageable tasks or pieces of the puzzle, and reconvene to make progress. More generally, making progress visible. And we talked about having newsletters and communications. You know, if you're having monthly meetings, you got to do something during the month to engage people. So you got to, you know, let people know what's happening, send emails out, maybe emails that are chains that they get responses from people, but at least at a minimum, keep people informed. And how do you address funding and sustainability? And goodness, I wish I knew this, but and we mentioned, you know, grants, federal grants, state government grants, private philanthropic funding, corporations, you know, those sort of sources. Really thinking about who are the benefits going to flow to over time, and can we hit them up? You know, even if these are downstream benefits, can we hit them up now to try to realize it? You talk about looking at grateful patients and families, you know, who've been through some of this, especially if it's sort of an academic, like a Michigan in the community. If there's an infrastructure coming out of it, it's challenging, but just get people to see how else this can be used, and see if you can get a little bit of buy-in from other folks that can use what we're building. And again, someone mentioned the question about, you know, value. Well, consider cost savings, consider life savings, and consider value that's flowing from this, and bring that back to the sustainability. So I'll pause now and say there was another note taker and other people from the group very engaged. So I'm going to be quiet and see if there's anyone else from the group who wants to add anything I missed.
If no, I would just like to give a shout out for the Ignite talks, the learning networks that Alexandra is involved with Cincinnati Children's. You know, they're phenomenal. I have been involved in a collaborative. It's the Michigan Surgical Quality Collaborative. And they have given some amazing talks. I know Michelle is doing that with OHCA. And I like the way in Alexandra's group, they're called Ignite, because it really like puts, you know, gives people a fire. You know, it's like, yeah, this is what we're doing it for, whether it's, you know, childhood epilepsy or in MSQC, they had, which is a bunch of surgeons and nurses who work with the surgeons, and they had somebody come and talk about his opioid addiction, and it was riveting. And you could just see the audience, you know, wow. And they had another patient come and talk about their surgical experience. And, you know, I can say as a nurse myself in the medical field, you know, especially a surgeon, you know, sees the patient in a very small amount of time. And, you know, so to then see what their surgery, what kind of impact it had, both for good and for negative, like with the opioid abuse, it was riveting. I've never seen a bunch of surgeons so excited. So it really can make a big difference. And Michelle and Lisa, I don't know if there's any thing you would like to add, and then we can also open it up for the previous chat. Are there things we didn't get to or that you would like to talk about now? Because we have a few minutes. So this is kind of our time to get a chance to do that.
I don't have anything to add. I just wanted to supplement what you were saying about the Ignite Talk. We don't call it Ignite Talks. I mean, this is and Alexandra's research has found, but the survivor stories that we do, it's the balance between, it's very emotional because this person has survived a sudden cardiac arrest, and they're one of very few people nationally, actually, but across the 2 counties for sure. And it always at the end of that that talk, which is usually at the beginning of the meeting, everyone's always so rejuvenated to get into tackle this problem, which we have an overarching goal of increasing survival rates across Washington and Livingston County using the learning health system approach. And hopefully we hope to scale it to larger, maybe statewide. But everyone's always so rejuvenated to tackle this problem after one of the survivor talks. So it's a really, really effective method, and I would recommend any learning community figure out how they can incorporate this into their activities.
Mm.
I'd like to jump on the back of that. I mean, Michelle's making a really excellent point. Building a learning community and making it work and sustaining it over time is really hard. It requires a lot of coordination, a lot of effort. It's challenging. You're doing something that's not been done before. Sometimes the work you want to do comes into conflict with the pre-existing structures within your organization. You need to have things that really effectively motivate the people in your group. And because of the way that they highlight the experiences of certain group members, often a patient or a community member, but also sometimes physicians or other members of the care team, those talks realign everyone with the purpose and snap everyone back into focus. I can't overstate how effective they can be for setting the tone for one of your larger group meetings.
Yeah. And Heather had a comment about the different perspectives. Heather, sorry, is it okay if you talk?
Yeah, I talk too much, so I'm always afraid to jump in. I'm sorry.
No.
It's really interesting. We have like a mixed method certificate in our program at UAB that Dr. Ivankova teaches, and she's well known for mixed methods. And I took this class with, I didn't do the certificate, but the class is mixed methods with action research, which is very similar to learning health system and continuous improvement in a community setting. And one of the things I asked her up front, I was like, I'm not interested that much in working out in the community, but I want to apply this in health informatics. And she said, many people do that. In that case, your community is the clinical informatics and the care team and things like that. So she really put that in my head that you don't always have to define your community. Obviously, it's really important to include the community. I'm not saying that at all, but in my realm, a lot of times we don't include that. I'm just looking at what's happening in the hospital, in the unit, in the data, and that's my community, and that's who we're trying to make sure we have that interprofessional team and everybody speaks up and they feel like they're heard and things like that. That's all I was trying to say.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I certainly have been involved with learning communities that are only hospital-based or department-based, and it's trying to change a culture in one particular one, trying to change a culture that was extremely top-down. So yeah, you're right. It can have all different kinds of forms, and I'll put Jordan on the spot now, and because he has a department level one too.
Yeah, we do. We have so we have an overall department level one that's got about 10 to 12 teams, depending on some are active and some get paused due to clinician availability. But we have some of the same challenges, brought a lot of examples and discussions today, but I think it comes down to the individual mission of the team. So one of our teams do engage with patients, and that's a process we've developed, and others will probably likely do so a little bit more in the future, but that's something we're trying to build out. So our focus has really been getting our processes and our infrastructure set up and starting to train our clinic team members on how we can move through the learning health system together over the past year and a half. One thing I would add, that was an interesting discussion. We talk about who's part of the learning health system community. We developed kind of a communication plan where I'm one of the core members of pretty much every learning health system team, and our individual, what we call our LHS team champion, is a core member of the given community. So one of our clinicians, Dr. Cones, is a spine clinician who's the LHS team champion for the spine team. And so him and I will meet in every LHS spine team meeting, but we're flexible to how the rest of the community meets with us, depending on the ongoing mission. So sometimes we'll bring in our data analyst, Mary, to join for part of the meeting or all the meeting or none of it, depending on what we're talking about. Sometimes we'll bring in the other spine clinicians, but that has really seemed to help our learning health system, considering how many different new priorities have been thrown to our clinicians over the past year and a half. So I think it really comes down to the mission and having an overall plan, being a little bit flexible to what comes up with our stakeholders, so we're not burning everyone out, I guess.
You know what, I'm going to also say that's part of the advantage that Jordan has, that he is embedded in his own department and working on it. So he has been able to continue to make progress during these very challenging last 19-20 months. Some of the projects I was working with the hospital as an outside person kind of came to a halt because of the pandemic, because everybody just stopped and focused on, a very important task at hand. So, so then I, needed to shift gears. So yeah, so that's kind of an important distinction. Who would think about that ahead of time? But that's been an advantage there. Yeah. Let's see. Josh, you're way past me on Pika Kuka? What?
I'm showing Ignite talks and Petra. It's another kind of talk that's very similar to Ignite. Really, really compelling. 20 slides, 20 seconds a slide.
Okay, that's great. That's good.
Earlier I showed the Ignite talks that are 20 slides every 15 seconds, whatever. It's pretty similar. Okay. These are very compelling kinds of talks.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or things that you want to talk about? Yes. Catherine asked, can I talk about, I asked about financial sustainability of an LHS. Is there a business model or department supported? Do you have a specific kind of thought with that? Because it really depends on the nature of the learning community.
Well, I guess I was asking just for different scenarios. Obviously, if it's within department, then maybe it's just department supported, and that, one can kind of create that. But if it's something larger, are people creating, there's a margin to a billing code, which then, we're trying to accomplish a certain mission. I guess my question is at the end of the day, are most of these funded by some, I'll call it third-party support? There's a grant, the department is saying, here's some excess funds. Or do some of them actually have a business model where we're accomplishing something that's maybe, a certain payment model from an insurance company for, care improvement, or it's that issue of, is this a concept that has a business underpinning in certain scenarios that are aligned with mission and effectiveness?
Okay. And if anybody else wants to jump in, I do know, it really, really depends. I was involved, for example, with going back to the surgical area. I was involved with a learning community where they had a small foundation grant. I think it was probably only $50,000. And they funded a nurse navigator half-time for a 2-year period with that grant money. This is several years ago by now, and it's still going on. The learning community is still going on. They were able to demonstrate that by having the nurse navigator, the number of infections, surgical infections went down, and that was a shorter stay in the hospital. And so at the end of that 2 years, the hospital administration decided that there was enough value, that value proposition, to hire a nurse navigator to run that system full time. So they had kind of seed money from a foundation. And then, so that's one way you can do it with seed money. Some of the ways that Josh outlined earlier with that scenario about foundations or families. I would say that there are some that are very business model oriented. And I don't know if somebody else wants to jump in. Lisa's kind of a business expert.
I can.
Oh, Alexandra, yeah, please.
I've seen a few different ways that learning communities support themselves over time, and sustainability is one of those thorny issues, and it's one that's people are still figuring out strategies for. So I will just start there. I'm not aware of any where there's a relationship between the insurance company and a way to bill it or consider it part of care improvement, but I imagine that that's the next step, right? This seems like an obvious thing. If we could get it to work, it would be fabulous. The things that I typically see are federal, a combination of federal funding or foundation funding, philanthropy, site fees. So if you have a network that has members, sites at different institutions, there can be a dues model where the division chief or department head commits a certain amount of funding for that network to participate, or for that site to participate in the community or network. A lot of groups, when they organize around a health problem of interest, there may be an advocacy organization that also is working on that problem, and that can be a fruitful partnership, both in terms of actual work on the learning community, but also a source of funding. And finally, what I think is an emerging source of revenue, but one that should probably be carefully considered, is pharmaceutical companies and medical device makers. Because learning networks and learning communities can establish patient registries and accumulate lots of patient data, this may be something that's attractive to these people in the future, but obviously the implications of this are very complex. But I want to mention it as a potential source of revenue. The best practice recommendations for financial sustainability in these types of organizations is to try to have a diversified revenue stream, so that you're not dependent on any one source of funding or any one set of funder priorities.
So Jane, I can comment as well what our department is doing. So right now, we're funded from organizational investment from the dean. And so we don't have any main grants, whether it's private or public at the moment. Long-term, we would like to develop some optionality for, as Alexandra mentioned, having diverse streams of income is very valuable. But our main reason, I believe, one of the main reasons we obtained that investment was the importance of generating evidence-based practice for PM&R. And PM&R is a little bit more challenging due to the patient comorbidities and the complexities in the care for generating evidence. And so that's a lot of the focus of our work. And so we've got a few team members. So myself and a data analyst are basically 100% on the project. And then we have a few team members who are about mixed, somewhere between 20 and 70% on the project. And we've got a faculty lead who's kind of in charge of it, who's got about 20 to 30, I think, percent on it. And then we have other team members, like our clinic team members, who aren't currently efforted on it, but we try to work with them in a way that it's part of their ongoing clinic work where possible. So we try to find alignment so we're minimizing the cost and maximizing the benefit to their work right now. that may change in the future. That's another, I guess, approach to what we're doing.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. All right.
Jane, I was looking, I couldn't find it, but it was reminding me also, we had Dr. Eric Gordon from Ross Business School come to speak at one of our collaboratories one time about an LHS value proposition. So maybe I can dig that up. Do you remember that?
Yes. You know what, if I can speak informally, off the record, everybody, you know what, I think he didn't want that to be recorded, or he was thinking about, I think, writing that up, maybe. So I think
that's why I can't find it.
I think that's why you can't find it.
I was ferociously looking for it just now. I found his, which this, maybe we could share this, because I found, we do have on the website his value proposition, like diagram.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it's kind of hard without him talking about it. But anyway, so that was another thing that I thought might be helpful to this conversation. But
okay, all right. And then Mayank, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but cannot a learning health system integrate itself with a data-driven smart city? Responsive adaptive. The LHS's social sciences department can double as custodian of social data, administrative data, CCTV feeds. China has every single inch of road covered in CCTVs. So LHS can be the data center custodian of social informatics and law enforcement agencies. Police can check out the CCTV feed revenue for LHS. That is true, but I don't know. Here in the US, we can't even agree on vaccines, let alone anything like more complicated. So I know we were way, way far from that. But that's true. That could be a revenue stream. I think the people who wouldn't want to take a vaccine, I think would never go for that kind of data collection. Of course, now Google and everybody else, Facebook is already collecting that kind of data, but you know, I think another topic by people who know a lot more than I do. Dr. William Yasnoff is a key thinker leader behind HRBA. He has presented at UMich, so that would be another source. We are going to get on with the closing portion because it's getting close to wrapping up. So hang on. Oh, I also wanted to, well, this is kind of in the resources too, but the Anderson Center at Cincinnati Children's has some great modules, and they do have one on sustainability and financial funding, Catherine, if you wanted to look that up. And okay. So I will just briefly go over sustainability, if I can get this to go. I'm glad you guys are a nice, friendly group here. Okay, let's see. So this isn't a one-size-fits-all. We kind of talked about it a little bit. Ideally, it should include financial and people-related planning. And Lisa said earlier, it really should begin at the very outset of planning for your learning community. So some of the things to think about are having a strong vision and mission for the learning community. I'm going to also back up that by having evidence, if you can, of keeping to your objectives, you know, and your timelines, and showing kind of your value. So having a value proposition that you can articulate, funding sources for or in-kind contributions, and as was already mentioned during the discussion, a diverse mix of funding sources may be preferable, especially if you have a large scoped learning community. you want to kind of not put all your eggs in one basket. Documenting your resources, roles, responsibilities, time commitments, having a recruitment strategy to replace those leaders who burn out, or hopefully maybe you can spread the load across so they don't burn out, or other stakeholders. And then always thinking about as technology updates happen, data access, things like that, having plans. And then I'm finally going to say it's the team, the team, the team. And for those people who aren't from the University of Michigan, that's from our storied winningest football coach of yesteryear, Beauchamp Beckler, who said it's all about the team. And that's apt for learning communities as well. So to continue to develop relationships with all of your stakeholders, whether they're internal to your department or external. Communicate more than you think you need to. And I think anybody who has been involved with any group that's 2 or more people know that communication, and then convey enthusiasm, joy, and passion for your mission and for the people who support it too. So we just wanted to thank you for being part of this afternoon, and we hope it was a reasonable use of your time. So a learning community engages in co-learning, and I'm sure that we have, well, I know I've heard some things that concepts that I didn't know about before. So thanks for being a part of our education as well. So I think there will be some kind of link, if not now, at least to the email for the link to these slides and stuff for a survey. So if you, we'd really appreciate it if you would fill it out to let us know what we can do, and what kinds of programming you want to see in the future too for the LHS Collaboratory. If you have any questions, those are our contacts. And then finally, here are some resources. So those first 2 there, if you can see my cursor, are for the guide that Josh put the link into already. It's the our department's Operationalizing a Learning Community Guide. The Cincinnati Children's modules are fantastic, and they are, the link is there. Then MSQC, that surgical collaborative I talked about, actually, and that is funded by Blue Cross Blue Shield Foundation, not the insurance itself, but their foundation branch supports, I think, like 20 different quality improvement networks. And they, with the support of Dr. Friedman and the collaboratory that provided some funding, came up with a very nice guidebook too for a regional collaborative. And there's another link to the LHS 101 workshop that Chuck did, and the slides. And then finally, oh, you know what? One thing we didn't put in here that we should have is the LHS journal. You can find a link to the LHS journal. You can just Google that, or you can find it on our department website too. And then finally, the LHS Collaboratory series this year for people who didn't get enough information about data. This whole year is we're having the theme of data and the learning health system. And at that link, you can find past programs and then find out about ones coming up. And I think that is it. So thank you for attending, and I hope you have a really good day, and I hope you'll learn something. So thank you.
Thank you.